Welcome back to my Ask a Knitter series, where I answer common questions that I get asked by knitters when I'm out teaching. In today's lesson, we're going to take a look at modifying sleeves, because it is probably one of the most common questions I get asked, and it's something that almost everyone needs to modify, whether you want a larger or a smaller upper arm. Perhaps you want to lengthen your sleeve or make it a little bit shorter. It's something that you are almost definitely, if you knit garments, going to have a question about at some time. If you're enjoying our Ask a Knitter series, please make sure that you subscribe so that you will not miss the next lesson. But for now, let's get into the answer. When you're knitting a sleeve, and if you lay it out flat, this is more or less what it's going to look like. This down here is the cuff, and this is the upper arm. Now this may be joined in the round, or it might be knit flat like this. When you've got knitting graph paper, each one of these square widths shows the width of your stitch, and vertically the shorter ones are the rows. So you can actually draw in how many rows you'll have from your underarm to your cuff. You can draw how many stitches in just by counting out the number of blocks across here you'll have in your upper arm, and how many you'll have in your cuff. So you can actually see, drawn down like this, what it's going to look like basically knitted on paper. So if you are working either flat or in the round from the bottom, from the cuff up to the underarm, you will be working increases. So on each side, you're going to be having an increase kind of at the start and end of the row, or start and end of the round, and you're going to be increasing from the cuff up to the underarm. Your cuff, you can see you'll have a certain section that will be straight, then you'll start your increases, and then you may also possibly have another section that's straight, because the bicep at the top will often be a little wider. Particularly if you've got wider biceps, you may want to have a section here that is, it reaches the full width a bit sooner. So in that case, it will go from here out to here, from here, let me pull this down further, out to here. So the increases happen sooner. If you want to make sure that you want it wider around the wrist down here, then you will also start increasing more quickly. The opposite is going to happen if you're coming from the top down. It's going to be decreases are worked, and if you want a wider bicep, you might work a certain section straight and then begin working your decreases and then having it straight for the cuff. But drawing it out makes it a lot clearer what it all looks like. But so now that you've got a little bit of an overview of how sleeves are put together, whether it's increases going from the bottom or decreases coming from the top down, gives you a little bit of a picture of what it looks like. So if you know that you need to modify sleeves, maybe you've got shorter arms or longer arms, and you always find yourself getting caught and not really sure how to modify or where to modify, I would get started with that knitted graph paper like I was showing you, because it will give you an accurate size of the stitches, because of course stitches are wider than they are tall. So if you use standard graph paper, it's going to give you a slightly inaccurate picture, because it's going to make you look like each row is as tall as the stitch is wide, which is not true. So draw it out if in doubt. Then the next thing I would encourage you to do after drawing it out and getting a feel for where you're at is to measure your own body, because you may have it may be that while in theory the actual measurements for the sleeve that you can see in the schematic, if you go to the back of a pattern, there should be a schematic. Always look at the schematic, because that's going to give you the actual dimensions of the finished knit. So you can see the size of the upper arm, and you can see the size of the cuff, and you can see the length of the sleeve. Then go measure your own arm and check each of those against it, because that will let you know if you need to make adjustments to the size of the upper arm, the cuff, or that length. So that's where you're going to get started. And then the next thing you're going to take a look at is where you will make those changes and how you can incorporate them into a pattern. But before we go any further, I should give you warning about one thing, and that is, if you do sleeves in the round, usually from the top down, but it may be from the bottom up as well, you will probably find that your gauge is going to tighten up a lot. This is a really common phenomena. It's similar to, you know, if you're knitting socks, there's something about the smaller needles or the smaller gauge, whether it's magic loop or double pointed needles or several, you know, the shorter needles. It just it means that people's gauge naturally tightens up. So if you feel the sleeve is too small, but in theory the measurements should be okay, I would suggest you pull out your gauge ruler and measure the gauge of your sleeve, and you may actually discover that your gauge has tightened up. So there's a couple of ways of adjusting that. The first one would be, which I attempt to do, doesn't always work, is just deliberately actually relaxing my tension and being careful not to pull it too tight. If that just does not work for you, and some people it really doesn't, then just go up a needle size and that might be enough to do it. Or the third one, which often actually helps me, is to change the type of needle tip. So if I've been using metal, very often that will give me a slightly tighter gauge, whereas moving to bamboo, kind of, it seems to just loosen it up by holding it a little bit softer. Maybe it's the material or something, but that can sometimes do the job as well. So there are a few different things that you might want to test, but first thing I would definitely always do is check your gauge, and don't assume that it's going to match the rest of your garment, because it almost always gets tighter. So that's the number one thing to check out. So now this one here, the reason I'm pulling it up is you can see this is a shorter sleeve. And there's two reasons for that. The first one is that it's not designed to be full length. This is one that's designed to be a 3/4 length sleeve, which will come to around here. But in addition to that, it's a drop shoulder. So it doesn't start at the top of the shoulder like a set-in sleeve would. It actually starts all the way out here. So that actually means that, like the top of it here, you probably want a little bit more length anyway. Sleeves, generally speaking, are going to have the increases from the top down at the underarm here. And if this was from the bottom up, you'd have those increases along there. Same thing if it's work flat, you usually have it in each end start and the end of each row. If you've got a pattern that has it right at the edge, I would generally bring it back in a stitch or two, particularly if it's done flat, because that will give you a couple of stitches at the edge that are much easier to seam together. Because if you've got increases or decreases right at the edge, it's actually really tricky to seam it up. I do also find that even though you may have enough stitches up here at the top, but you can see if you take a look at the way my arm is constructed, the top part here, the bicep, actually stays wide almost all the way down to the elbow. Like it gets a little narrower, but it's still pretty wide. So you may actually decide to modify the way decreases are worked in this. So if that's the case for you and you find that by the time you get to the elbow it's getting a bit tight, particularly if it's a very fitted sleeve, you could actually either slow down or remove some of the increases from here, or even just move that first decrease down a little bit further in the sleeve rather than it happening further up. And that will give you a bit more room up along here. Could be the same thing down here where, if it gets too tight down here, then you may also perhaps remove some of those decreases coming down. Now, you see the cuff of this, it's got a rolled edge and it's fitted but not too fitted. And this one really relies on it being the right length, because with it being a little open like this, because there's no gathered cuff, like this one has got ribbing which is going to gather it in, this one very much relies on the fit being right and even taking into consideration the fact that it rolls at the edge. So for this, I did try it on a lot to actually adjust to make sure I got the decreases correct going down. And if in doubt, you can actually slow down the decreases, and then before you have a cuff like this, or even before the very edge, you can have a few more decreases happening just in one round together like that, so that you get the cuff fitting. If in doubt, you can also slow it down and drop the needle size you have for the cuff, or use a type of ribbing or edging that pulls it in a bit tighter, so it can give you a nice snug fitting cuff as well. So there's all sorts of ways of making the cuff or the end of it fit a bit better, while still leaving a bit more room on the sleeve if you prefer it that way. And you can also adjust the length of the sleeve you want. If you like your sleeves a little longer, then just add a little bit more length as you're knitting through it. If you're always pushing them up anyway, then just change it up to this length. But if you do change it to be up to this length, you want to make sure you take a couple of decreases out, because take a look here, this part is still a good bit wider. So if it's ending here, you're going to want, a couple of extra inches, well, 1 inch anyway. See, this can reach all the way around here, but it's probably a good inch wider up here. So remember that when you're doing decreases, if you're modifying it, that you're going to want this part wider if it ends here versus here. And then obviously a short sleeve, it's just a matter of if it's top down, you just pick it up and end it right along here. So very straightforward. If you're adjusting lengths and you don't want to change the overall stitches at the top or at the bottom, adding length is fine. You can just do it either evenly spaced, a little bit between each, or you might add extra space at the top between them so that you've got a slightly bigger bicep, but then keep the same rate down here. Or alternatively, if you're making it shorter, that you probably want to be a little bit more careful with that, because you may opt to keep it a little bit wider here, but then increase it a little bit faster down there. Or even leave it as in the pattern, shorten it, and then do a round where you've got a lot of decreases at the bottom. So there's kind of quite a few different ways that you can adjust it. But the biggest things that I always would suggest to bear in mind are, make sure that you measure your arm and take a look at all of the different places. And if you try it on and it's feeling too tight, go ahead and take some of those decreases if you're going down out, so that it's going to feel more comfortable, because it's quite hard to add much extra ease into a sleeve the same way as you do with the body, because there's only a few stitches really, so to speak, when you're kind of working around it. But if you would share any modifications that you've made to sleeves before, or perhaps anything that you run into difficulty with that you maybe like extra help with, and we can do another Ask a Knitter lesson on the questions that come in. So remember, anytime you do have more questions, pop them in and they will make another little lesson that we can chat about other problems that you might encounter, or even something that you don't think about that is a more widespread issue, and when you put it up there could be like hundreds of people goes like, yeah, that happens to me all the time as well. So you never know what kind of problems people are encountering, so it's always worth asking, and you never know what answers you'll get. I hope you enjoyed today's video in our Ask a Knitter series. If you want to watch the next one, make sure that you subscribe, because we have got coming up next all about garment construction. First of all, we're going to take a look at drop shoulder construction, what body styles it's going to work with, how you can modify it, and different ways that you can knit it. So thank you for watching very much today.